seated. In Orthodox iconography, the resurrection is often not depicted by an empty tomb and white-robed figures proclaiming, "He is not here, he is arisen." Most often, the icon chosen to represent Easter is called the Harrowing of hell. Christ standing on the broken doors of hell, pulling up heroes and anti-heroes of the faith alike. Adam and Eve, and David, that philandering coward, and Solomon, the hoarding womanizer, but also Abel, the Bible's first martyr, and John the Baptist, the first martyr of the New Testament. The word harrowing means robbing. And whenever I see this icon, I am struck by the broken locks and chains that litter the image. Jesus is the one who breaks the locks and rends the chains that bind us, all our obligations and regrets, words and actions spoken and done in haste, and he leaves a pile of rubble when he sets us free. Matthew has undertaken a colossal task in his gospel. He sets out to record events 50 to 100 years in the past with very few primary sources to help him. He intends to help a Jewish Christian audience make sense of the fact that a movement that began with an itinerant Jewish preacher spread like wildfire among Gentiles. And he wants to be sure that the blossoming theology of the church would be clearly represented in the story. Now, when it comes to the Gentiles, that's the Hebrew word that means the nations, right? Matthew strategically places these non-Jews throughout his gospel and puts on their lips confessions of faith. There's the Magi, the wise men who called Jesus king at his birth. And then here at the end, this centurion who calls him God's son, a theological confession and a subversive message against the emperors of Rome who would take that title for themselves. But when it comes to conveying the beliefs of the early church, Matthew gets a little clunky. In today's gospel, Matthew is trying to incorporate the harrowing of hell, which, as far as theology goes, was probably a really big deal in the first century or so, but was probably declining in prominence even as Matthew's writing his gospel. But the doctrine is about the question of faithful Jews who were martyrs who fell to Rome before Jesus. Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan put it this way in their book, The Last Week. Since God's purpose was to establish a just and nonviolent earth, it had to start with the past before it could deal with the future. There was already a great backlog of injustice that had to be redeemed, a great crowd of martyrs who had to be vindicated. Thus, Matthew, following a very early tradition, claims that Jesus descended to hell, proclaimed liberation, and was resurrected as the head of the holy ones. Unfortunately, when Matthew tries to stick it into his carefully constructed account, it gets a little clumsy. One cumbersome thing is that the dead appear to be raised on Friday when Jesus dies and the earth quakes, and that seems really convenient for like tombs opening, but they don't start letting folks know what happened until after Sunday morning. You see, there's like a mess here, right? Like some of my sermons, Matthew seems to have lost his thesis. So, mired in theological questions that he can't figure out how to articulate, like, is it Jesus' death that raises us, or is it his resurrection? And does the resurrection not really count until Jesus is himself raised? And also, how do they get from earth to heaven if they're just hanging around appearing to folks? Matthew does this all the time. Like on Palm Sunday, he has Jesus ride on a donkey and a colt at the same time. Like, It's just awkward. But all the other gospel writers, like when they get to this, they just have a Saturday of silence because they don't want to unglue the cross from the empty tomb. But that messy middle that Matthew can't let go of is pretty much life on earth, right? Unshakable illness and whatever you talked to your therapist about last week and the unethical baloney of institutions that reside in ivory towers, we live in that moment between what God has already done for us and its full completion. We live in the messy middle. We are bound by sin that looks most often like structural racism and systemic oppression. It looks like homophobia, and it loves to say, "Not in my backyard," to those most in need. It looks like the pain that we cause each other and the way power stomps on the most vulnerable. It looks like all the words that we wish we could just take back and everything we've left unsaid. We live in a messy middle where evil takes what it wants without regard for the future. And its locks are named fear and complacency. And in that deep pit of this particular hell, the great accuser is telling each of us that God is angry with us and that it is God who has bound us here. So I'm so glad that Matthew doesn't pick silence. I'm so glad that he enters the fray of the messy middle between cross and empty tomb, because Jesus comes into the messy middle to proclaim liberation and release. This time of year, I return again and again to the words of an obscure theologian named Bill Williams. I only know of him because we went to the same seminary a decade apart. And he writes in his book, Naked Before God, The Return of a Broken Disciple, this is the truth. Jesus came to fetch us. We are the lost sheep, the prodigal children, the scattered chicks, the lost coins. It isn't just to some long ago dead that Jesus comes to proclaim release, but Jesus comes every day to our messy lives that we might be set free. Jesus comes not to condemn us or to mock us or to leave us behind, but to fetch us, to proclaim to us freedom, and to break every chain. I love how the pastor and poet Marin Tirabassi puts it in her poem, Saturday. It's Saturday, and Jesus is proclaiming to the dead and telling them to be ready for his well-planned prison break. Even the guy with the bigger barns and the woman whose oil burned out at the gate of joy, and he just catches Judas's eye. It's never a detour when Jesus goes to hell. And if Easter is really every Sunday, Saturdays always find Jesus visiting you and me and those dear to us who are lost in hell, and if we can't find our keys, gives us a lift. At our best, I hope that our weekly proclamation in this place and at this time, in the midst of our messy lives, is a ride out of hell on a millennias-long parade with Jesus at its head. That the water that's poured over us in baptism is a key that opens every locked door. That the music we sing shakes the earth enough to raise it. Beloved of God, should you today find yourself walking through hell or just one hell of a mess, I pray that my words this morning sound to your ears like chains breaking, like doors coming off their hinges, and like a voice that calls you out into a new day. Amen.